Hello, my name is Christine Albano. I'm with the Desert Research Institute in Reno, Nevada. And today I'm going to be talking about a new project that's aimed toward quantifying environmental water requirements for groundwater-dependent ecosystems in Nevada. And before I jump into the presentation, I'd just like to acknowledge my co-authors on this work, Dr. Laurel Saito, who is the Nevada Water Program Director at the Nature Conservancy, and Dr. Stephen Lowhide, who's a professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison. So groundwater-dependent ecosystems, or GDEs, as I'll refer to them in this presentation, are ecosystems that rely on groundwater to maintain their ecological structure and function. They include things like springs, phreatophytic trees and shrubs that tap into groundwater through their roots, as well as rivers, lakes, and wetlands. And as a state that's groundwater rich and precipitation poor, Nevada has an abundance of these ecosystem types. So GDEs have outsized importance economically, ecologically, and culturally. They provide water storage and purification. They store carbon. They provide many recreational and economic benefits, and many of them are considered sacred to indigenous peoples. In addition to that, they provide habitats to a wealth of species, including many rare and endemic species, that is, those that are found only in Nevada. So given the values of GDEs that I just described, it's important that we understand the implications of water withdrawals on these ecosystems. And in several recent publications listed at the bottom of this slide, observed declines in vegetation vigor have been documented over the past 35 years using satellite observations. And these are, in some cases, coincident with declines in groundwater levels. As one example here, I'm showing declines in riparian vegetation or vigor as measured by a satellite-based metric called NDVI along the Quinn River near Orovada. And we see declines in NDVI indicated by that red color over the course of well over 20 miles of stream. And it's very plausible that this is being caused by rapidly declining groundwater levels that are just adjacent to the stream. And this is indicated by those various colored dots, which represent groundwater levels in wells. And we can see declines on the order of 1 to 2.5 feet per year in some cases. And so this is an administrative groundwater basin where the appropriation of water rights is about 1.5 times the estimated perennial yield. And this water rights allocation situation is actually pretty representative of that of the rest of the state as a whole. That is, across the entire state, the amount of water appropriated is 1.5 times the estimated perennial yield. And this is being driven by overappropriations occurring in about 1/3 of all groundwater basins. So given the fact that we value these ecosystems and the services they provide, and in the context of water rights allocations and the many competing uses for limited water resources, the work I'm presenting today is aimed toward gaining a better understanding of what groundwater flows and levels are needed to sustain those values and ecological functions of GDEs. And as you can imagine, this is a very broad question because it depends on what ecological functions and values you're talking about. So to narrow the scope a bit, and for this work I'm going to be talking about today, our focus is on vegetation. And I say this with the recognition that the needs of vegetation aren't necessarily the same as for birds or fish or invertebrates. But we focus here on vegetation as a starting point for this analysis, given that it can be considered in some ways a master variable. It defines the structure of habitats for other species. Vegetation is in and of itself one of those competing water users. And vegetation is also something that is just more readily measured and observed than other types of biota. So in this case, we have more of the kinds of data that we need to understand responses of groundwater dependent ecosystems for vegetation relative to other taxa. So using vegetation data, there are several methods for estimating vegetation groundwater use, and these include the use of tracers, water table fluctuations, water or energy balance equations, and remote sensing approaches. Each of these have limitations though, although they are all useful methods. The former two tend to require very site-specific measurements, and the latter are often too coarse in scale to apply to narrow riparian GDEs or GDEs that tend to be small in size. Perhaps more importantly, they don't provide the process understanding that allows us to understand how the water needs of vegetation vary over space and time, and in the face of novel conditions under changing groundwater availability. So I'm going to spend the rest of the presentation giving a pretty high-level overview of a new project that was recently funded by the Bureau of Reclamation WaterSmart Applied Science Grant. And this is a collaboration between DRI, the Nature Conservancy, and University of Wisconsin, Madison. And the overall goals are to fill some of the gaps that I just mentioned and to enhance our process-based understanding of GDE vegetation responses to groundwater availability. In addition to that, the goal is to provide scientifically defensible estimates of groundwater flows and levels that are needed to sustain vegetation in these ecosystems. So our overall approach is to develop and test mechanistic models of GDE plant water use and biomass production, and to use these to generate estimates of water needs for different types of GDEs and across a range of environmental settings. So on the right, I'm showing our study area, which essentially includes the environmental gradient from the Sierra Nevada and across the Great Basin. And these colored areas indicate places within which we are actively seeking or have already acquired field data to calibrate our models. In particular, we will be relying on a well-curated 35-year data set of groundwater levels, soil moisture, and vegetation from the Inyo County Water Department, data from several wet meadows in the Central Great Basin, ideally groundwater levels data in eastern Nevada, and several data sets from the Sierra Nevada, including the Tahoe Basin. Once these models are developed, we'll model scenarios of changing groundwater availability to assess vegetation sensitivities to those changes. We'll then translate these results into a framework that can be used by stakeholders to estimate water needs based on the GDE type and its environmental setting. Finally, as part of this project, we'll incorporate these results into a web map application and use these to parameterize state and transition models that the Nature Conservancy has developed to gain an understanding of how ecosystems might be affected by changing groundwater availability. These last 2 points are a ways down the line, so today I'm mostly going to focus on these first 3 objectives. And before I go into what we propose to do, I'd like to mention that we will be developing the project in consultation with stakeholders, including those organizations shown here. And we'll be soliciting their feedback about what the most useful framing of our analysis and outputs will be. Our first workshop is set for February 23rd, and we'll be holding 2 additional workshops throughout the lifetime of the project. And so I'll take this opportunity to welcome participation from anyone who's interested, and I'll provide contact information and information on the time of the workshop at the end of this presentation. So to lay the groundwork for our research, design, and approach, I'd like to introduce the concept of the groundwater subsidy, which is a measure of how much vegetation benefits from the presence of shallow groundwater late in the season, and it's measured by comparing water use in the presence, as shown in the right, versus the absence, as shown on the left, of shallow groundwater. So the groundwater subsidy is distinct from what we think of as the groundwater component of ET, evapotranspiration, or ETG, which is a flux of water across a boundary. And as part of this project, we'll be measuring both of these using the model approach and concepts outlined in this paper by Chris Lowry and Steve Lowhide, which uses a one-dimensional VADOS model of root water uptake and plant production to quantify the groundwater subsidy. And to give a just slightly better picture of how these 2 concepts differ, these graphs are showing water use rates from ETG and the groundwater subsidy and how they vary over the course of the season in this Sierra Nevada meadow. So at the beginning of the season, ETG is high because the water table is near the surface. But as we get into later in the season, this decreases as the water tables decline. But the subsidy, that is the amount of additional water available to the plant because that shallow groundwater table is there, starts to increase. And so these two different plots show the contrast between thicker versus thinner soils, with the thicker soils having less reliance on the subsidy because they are able to hold on to more water later into the season. And so in addition to distinguishing the subsidy versus ETG concepts, these figures help to illustrate the role that different environmental settings may play in moderating the responses of GDEs to changing groundwater availability. We can similarly look at these kinds of graphs to understand the role of the groundwater subsidy and ETG for different water table depths, rates of change, timing, etc. So this concept helps us to get beyond a simple metric of how much groundwater plants use, and help to get to aspects of the groundwater flow regime that are important to vegetation and can help us to better understand vegetation sensitivities to changing groundwater availability. So our proposed research design is to apply the one-dimensional root water uptake models that were developed by Chris Lowry and Steve Lowhide to each of 3 different GDE archetypes. And these are shown to the right and include dryland phreatophyte shrubland such as greasewood, which is common across the state, an herbaceous wet meadow, and a riparian area, with each of these representing a characteristic set of soils, characteristic species traits, and characteristic ranges of groundwater depth. For each of these GDE types, we'll develop 3 to 5 models representing a range of climate and soil settings. For example, going from wetter to drier climate and coarse shallow soils to finer, deeper soils. These models will be calibrated using field data from the data sets I mentioned earlier. And the minimum data requirement for these models is monthly or higher temporal resolution groundwater levels measured directly within the GDE. And I'll mention here that we're definitely still seeking out additional data sets and opportunities to collaborate. So we'd be very glad to discuss this with anyone who has field data of this type and is interested in contributing to this effort. So in addition to the groundwater levels data, we'll be incorporating ancillary information on vegetation, soil moisture, and satellite remote sensing data to help us validate and constrain the models. The outputs of this modeling effort will include measurements of ETG, the amount of evapotranspiration that is due to groundwater, metrics of the groundwater subsidy, and estimates of vegetation biomass production. Once the models are calibrated and validated, we'll simulate scenarios of changing groundwater availability and quantify those model outputs I just mentioned as a function of varying groundwater depths to understand how declining groundwater levels, different drawdown rates, and changing seasonality of the groundwater regime due to warming temperatures have the potential to affect vegetation. So we've talked about looking at multiple GDE types, multiple environmental settings, and now multiple groundwater scenarios. And so you can imagine we have many factorials here, and we do indeed expect to have something on the order of 10,000 or so models. And what we can do with that is we can use the model parameters and outputs to create a synthetic data set. And that can be used to train a predictive regression model that will allow us to interpolate our results to unsampled settings, for example, so we can capture those places in between the environmental gradients where we don't have data. As a final step, we'll translate these results into what we call the groundwater requirements for GDEs framework, where the end user can identify the GDE of interest and its environmental setting attributes using readily available data sets, which could be observations or GIS or gridded data sets. And this framework would function as a lookup table or other easy-to-use tool that provides estimated ranges of the groundwater subsidy, vegetation productivity, ETG, etc., as a function of those attributes, and these are derived from those regression model results. And so, as I mentioned earlier, our goal is to provide a better understanding of water needs for groundwater-dependent ecosystems to maintain ecosystem function, and as well as how this varies across environmental gradients. And we see this aspect of understanding how responses vary across climate and soil attributes as especially important because we can't collect measurements at every site, and this can help us better anticipate and describe the conditions under which impacts of changing groundwater availability are most likely to be greatest for vegetation. In addition, these results will provide a quantification of GDE water use needs and sensitivities that we expect to be useful for planning, and that it can provide information that will allow stakeholders to better weigh trade-offs between the ecosystem services GDEs provide and competing uses, and make decisions about water allocations accordingly. In addition to this, we envision that these results can help to refine representations of GDE water use in other modeling efforts, such as numerical groundwater flow models, statistical models, or conceptual state and transition models. Finally, this is a 3-year project that just started a couple of months ago, so we're really just kind of getting it up and off its feet. And over the next 6 months, we'll be further developing the conceptual framework and research design I just presented. And we'll be holding a stakeholder workshop, as I mentioned, on February 23rd. And this will be a 1-hour workshop. It's aimed to be very much interactive, so that we can collect feedback on desired outcomes from the project. And I promise it won't be a repeat of this presentation. So from there, we'll spend about 1.5 years on the modeling component, and further down the road, once models are finalized, we'll develop the web map application, and the Nature Conservancy will start to incorporate results into their existing state and transition models. So I'll close by saying thank you for your attention, and please feel free to contact Laurel or myself for more information, or if you'd like to attend the upcoming workshop on February 23rd. Or if you'd like to join our mailing list for future workshops. I'm also happy to take your questions during the Q&A session following this, and thank you again, and hope to see you there.